for questions, and despite some rather sharp lights in my eyes, which might make it difficult for me to recognize even people with whom I'm very familiar, I will try to take the questions myself. Eric, I think I can see in touching the way to the mic, which is on its way.
So equality figures very prominently in the program laid out by the radical Enlightenment philosophers. But I wonder if you could say a bit more about what equality actually meant for them. These days, equality is certainly a widely shared value, but there's intense disagreement about what it entails. So there are people who favor equality of opportunity. They're willing to put up with wide disparities of income as long as those disparities are attributable to merit, and then the equality of outcome people who think that vast differences of income are inherently repugnant. So what about the radical Enlightenment?
Well, that's a big question, and of course the answer is inevitably a complicated one, but it meant in the first place equality before the law and the elimination of privilege, which was such a big problem for previous centuries. We've forgotten that, of course. We don't really know what it's like to live in an aristocratic-dominated society. We might come up with a shock on noticing that amongst the regulations guiding Joseph II's police in Vienna in the late 18th century, one of their main obligations was to give a good thrashing to coachmen and servants who were impertinent to aristocrats. This might well have shocked us, but we in general have forgotten what that means. But I think that the most important, the economic aspects are discussed quite a bit. Most of the radical Enlightenment people that I've talked about would reject outright confiscation from the rich and redistribution of wealth, but they did think that it was the responsibility of government, for a reason I'll explain in a moment, to try to organize taxation, for instance, and other aspects of policy against the richest and vested interests to try to work towards greater equality. So something like social democracy, although there were certainly communistic writers like Morelli and Mably in some moods who advocated outright confiscation and redistribution to get something more like economic equality. But I would say that both the communists and the main, if I can use that term, the main bloc of the radical Enlightenment, what they above all meant by equality is a rather complicated political concept which we've now lost any notion of, which is essentially Spinozistic, which is that the force of the state comes from all individuals. Everyone wants to be happy. Everyone wants something different. The only way that a political moral system can work that is genuinely democratic is if the government treats the interests of every individual equally. Whatever any individual wants, his interests or her interests should be treated equally. This means the duty of the government, Diderot expressly states this a number of times, the duty of the government is to prevent the majority or the people from being preyed on by vested interests. That is at the very heart of the conception of equality. And there was another question right next to you, I think, if you...
Thanks, yeah. You presented the radical Enlightenment view of human rights as rights that are being held against states, primarily. But of course, part of the point of the human rights regime in the late 18th century, both in France and in the US, was also they founded new states and they grounded the legitimacy of a new political order. So rights are not simply held against the state, but they're also ultimately upheld and defended by states. And I kind of thought that was the ambivalence you were going to discuss. I assumed that was going to be the tension you were going to take up, especially in relation to your introductory comments when you say we were the heirs of this radical Enlightenment tradition. It seems to me that the role played by human rights in contemporary political discourse is not so much as the kind of radical doctrine of popular sovereignty that you described, as much as a political mechanism for defining where the outer sovereignty of states lie. Right? So a state typically loses its legitimacy when it breaches the human rights of its people, and that gives the rights to more powerful states or Western states to intervene into their own affairs. It seems to me that human rights now act as mechanisms for regulating interstate relations,
yes,
not so much as the more radical doctrine of popular sovereignty that was very evident in the Haitian revolution, as you described, but I don't see much trace of it today, and I wonder whether the ambivalence of human rights resides there.
Well, you're certainly right that the emphases are different, and that today, of course, the function in our world of human rights is much more noticeable in international affairs than it is in internal domestic reform programs. Although it is noticeable in internal domestic reform programs, and that should be more so in a great many areas. Also, I would say that for the late 18th century, certainly there were a number of writers. Cerisier would be a good example, a Franco-Dutch writer who edited a newspaper in Leiden for many years called Le Politique Hollandais, and other places where you see among the examples frequently given of how monarchical states ignore the interests of the majority are the dynastic wars that they fought that were getting worse and worse in the 18th century. So debates about how to stop kings fighting wars, which can't possibly be in the interest of most people, and were leading to larger and larger numbers of men getting slaughtered and maimed, and etc., with all the social consequences that entailed. So the idea of the United Nations with an Assemblée Générale, it's called that in several of these texts, which would create international fora, would put pressure on states and force them to settle their disputes peacefully instead of going to wars. That aspect of international relations is in a way linked to this basic human rights ideal in a number of texts. I wouldn't say it's totally absent either in the late 18th century, but it's certainly true that the balance is different. Right in the back row is the questioner.
One aspect of this that fascinates me is the issue of sexual identity. Do any of the writers of this period address, shall we say, the rights of homosexuals and lesbians?
Well, that's an interesting question. They certainly do. And although there's a certain guarded terminology and vocabulary in the discussion of homosexuality, this is actually one of I said nothing about it, but it is one of the most important aspects of the human rights. It's perhaps wrong of me not to have mentioned it. Both in, we can't imagine living in a society, I mentioned before, we can't imagine living in a society where if we're rude to an aristocrat, we'll get a good thrashing from the police. But this is a society in which fornication, sexual relations outside of marriage, was still a crime in many or most European states. And it often very one-sidedly worked against unmarried girls and women, and could lead to terrible and extremely unfortunate and tragic consequences for large numbers of people. But this isn't to say that men didn't suffer from this as well. They did. The homosexuality was outlawed in most places, and it was acted against quite intensively in some countries at certain times. Why exactly it's more intensive in one place at a particular time than later is a problem for social historians, but there's no question that in the 1730s in Holland, hundreds of men were executed for the crime of homosexuality. And a large part of the discourse of this subject of rights, as it appears in the writings of these radical philosophers, is integrated into their wider rejection of the entire sexual theological code, which is not only proclaimed by the churches, but they think theology has succeeded in introducing into the legal system and the workings of the law, and quite wrongly so, and that both men and women have to be freed from this theological intrusion in the law, which leads to a state of general oppression of the sexual behavior of everybody, as they would put it. There's another question in the back row.
I was interested that I missed something. There are two things that I didn't hear about, and that was one was the right to life, which is actually playing a considerable role today in the debate over abortion, and the other is the pursuit of happiness, which seems to be unique in this whole discussion. And I just wonder whether that's true or whether there's anything that alluded to either of those things.
Well, the pursuit of happiness is expressly mentioned in these declarations. Le bonheur général is a term very prominent in this discourse of human rights in the late 18th century. The point of it's assumed that even though every individual wants something different, one person wants money, the next person wants something else, etc., etc., everyone wants to be happy. This is a basic Spinozistic Dolbachian idea, which is absolutely prevalent throughout this whole wing of the Enlightenment. And therefore, what the whole of society wants can be described as le bonheur général, and this is adopted as almost as an official term in these declarations. So that's very prominent here. The right to life and questions about abortion, that I haven't, at least specifically in relation to the issue of abortion, discussions about abortion, that I've not come across in my own reading. I may have just missed this, or simply, or perhaps it's not there. I'm not sure. This question down here. Can we?
And the modern philosophy of Spinoza and his followers. In the writings of Godwin and Paine, I mean, in their intellectual biography, is there a strong evidence of them actually not reading those who might have been influenced in this tradition, but directly reading Spinoza?
Oh yeah, Godwin and Paine read Spinoza, and if actually the Age of Reason, although Paine of course had never been to university, hadn't studied, he was an autodidact, and when he first began his sensational career in 1775 with this tremendous pamphlet which made such a big contribution to the American Revolution, Common Sense, his reading was probably rather restricted at that stage, and I would say apart from these Histoire philosophique, and it's been proven that there's a very minor Italian radical writer called Dragonetti who you may or may not have heard of, but who wrote a pamphlet against the aristocracy which had appeared in a bilingual version in London, and he expressly cites that a couple of times, one or two other texts, but he probably hadn't read very much by 1775. By the 1790s he'd read quite a bit. In the Age of Reason, a large part of it is Bible criticism, and the Bible criticism he lifts more or less completely from Spinoza. So there's no question that the later Paine, at any rate, had an extensive direct familiarity with Spinoza. Godwin was quite a widely read man and knew all these writers, and he expressly says in the preface to his most famous work that he began to think in this way as a result of reading the Système de la Nature, which was the most famous work of D'Holbach. In this corridor, there are two questions, actually. Two hands up.
Thank you for a well-done speech. How much interplay was there between the French human rights activists in the 1770s through the 1790s between the French and the American human rights activists?
Well, quite a lot, because Lafayette, of course, although his objectives, as I said, were slightly different, more restricted than some of the others, but Brissot, Mirabeau, and Volney was a very active and very radical and very prominent figure in the National Assembly, who was always right behind Mirabeau and Sieyès in pushing for these things, and one of the first to try and oppose anyone that wants to get anything theological against their principle. He went to America too. So these leading French exponents of human rights theory were very interested in America and had a fair degree, in several cases, of personal experience of America and a lot of American contact. But I want to say, in addition, that we should see all this as very much an international Atlantic phenomenon. There's a democratic revolutionary movement in Holland as well in the 1780s, and a very important revolution in Geneva in 1782, which is the first time, actually, that the rhetoric of democrats versus aristocrats is centrally used as part of the political battle. And it's interesting to see that both Mirabeau and Brissot were already published quite a lot and already established philosophes revolutionaries. revolutionaire, so a long time before 1789. They're almost professional philosophes revolutionaire before there was any revolution in France. As soon as the revolution began in Geneva, they went there to get experience, to be part of the scene and to learn as much as they could about what was going on.
Did the Americans have any influence on the French?
No, certainly they did. But, and I tried to bring that out in the lecture. I think that they were inspired by the American example to some extent, but that it would be equally true to say that they were critical of the American. The problem with the American Revolution was a great thing for them, but it stopped too soon. It didn't go far enough. It didn't do enough. That's the essence of it.
Thank you.
Yes. Dirk, if you've got the mic, please go ahead.
Yes, I do. You said at the beginning that our concept of human rights is essentially the radical Enlightenment concept. And I wanted to challenge you a little bit on social and economic rights, because those look philosophically a little bit more complicated. What used to be called negative rights seem to be the sorts of rights that impose duties on individuals as individuals, whereas things like a right to subsistence seem to be rights that impose duties on us as collectivities. And reflect on this for a moment. In the course of this lecture, there will have been, how many children who will have died as a result of not having their rights to basic subsistence met. Should we think that this person individually was responsible for that child, this one for that child, individually? Those subsistence rights seem to impose duties on us not as individuals, but as collectivities to solve those sorts of problems. And I wondered if whether the philosophers with their emphasis on the individual and his philosophical resources to think through what's happening in cases of rights like that. No, I very much think that they did. It's true that they put a lot of emphasis on the individual, but as I mentioned already, their conception of equality is individualism. It's very closely entwined with their conception of sovereignty and the role of the state in the duty of society. And I think for this reason, one has to interpret retreats. I think at an early stage, at the time when the encyclopedia was being composed, and something that this did want to spread to everyone, as going to be a free market, as they say there. That's the right way to organize economics. But as time went on, particularly the so-called war of the grain trade in the late 1760s, when you saw how in a particular country it was possible for some vested interests, for instance, to go on the grain market, to exploit grain price, to damage equal subsistence rights that this majority profit using a free market. That changed their minds. They never went to the long for that. They could say that economic freedom is a very important freedom up to a point, but it's got to be balanced and checked by all these other factors that make up basic human rights. But the laissez-faire free market forces ideology is something entirely rejected by them because it can be used to damage the interests of the majority, and that has to be the overriding factor. So the war of the grain trade in the late 1760s and through the 1770s, some of the more moderate Enlightenment people like Turgot never retreat from, and I think Condorcet has some trouble with this actually, but because he was quite close, he was very friendly with Turgot, so they disagreed sharply over metaphysical question. Turgot's moderate, deist, he hates all that right stuff. He was friendly with Condorcet. On this issue, Condorcet perhaps was a little bit torn, but certainly it's clear that Diderot and his friends didn't go along with any doctrine of laissez-faire, full market forces after a certain point. Precisely because of subsistence, the rights of subsistence come first. There must be somebody very eager to put a question at the back because of the laughter, but I can't see who.
Hello, yes, I've got the right of the mic. Penny Caulfield from London University. I just would like to add two more elements to your picture from the Anglo-Saxon tradition, and it seems to me cogent and attractive as your interpretation of the French intellectual tradition is. You're missing out radical Protestant religion. I'm thinking particularly of the contribution of the Quakers, but it also goes back to the English Civil War times and the equality of all in the eyes of the Lord. But in particular, in terms of human rights, the Quaker contribution to anti-slavery and the anti-slavery campaigns. Then, of course, it's not that all those involved in anti-slavery are Quakers, but the other element of that is that there is a public tradition of campaigning for human rights in the 19th century, which seemed to me, again, you rather underplayed, implying that this was a theoretical commitment that didn't really get activated until internationally until the 20th century. But these anti-slavery societies with a strong Quaker influence international, and is the campaign still going today?
Well, I wouldn't want you to interpret any of my remarks as being anti-Quaker in any way. I'm full of admiration for the Quakers, but one has to say that the Quakers have been around for a whole century before the anti-slavery movement began in Pennsylvania. And when it did begin, which is very, very late in Quaker history, nothing before the 1750s, the man who really gets it going and persuades the other Quakers they should really get rid of their own slaves, it was a job to do that even before they started telling other people they shouldn't have slaves. Antoine Benazet happened to be a Frenchman who read a great deal more in French and German than he did in English. And I emphasize this point because people immediately say, oh, you're downplaying Anglo-Saxon aspect, what about Quakers, etc., etc. What about religion? No, I mean, that's there, but let's keep things in proportion. The Quaker role begins at a very late stage, so subsequent to all this kind of thing. And the man who begins it, rather ironically, has absolutely nothing to do with Anglo-Saxon backgrounds, except that he happens to be living in Pennsylvania. And what's more, he opposed the American Revolution, which is a little bit awkward for some. The loyalist to Britain.
Well, let me invite you all again to continue this discussion in the Ford Hall Common Room, and to thank Jonathan again for the excellent lecture.
here to this discussion of secularism and human rights, basic human rights in history, philosophy, political science, and sociology, which is part of our celebration of the Institute's 80th anniversary. Our moderator today is Harold Shapiro, President Emeritus and Professor of Economics and Public Affairs at Princeton University, and, we'd like to say, since 2009, the trustee of the Institute.
Peter, thank you very much. Let me extend my own warm welcome to this morning's discussion that, as Peter said just a moment ago, centers around secularism and human rights. It is an honor and pleasure to serve as moderator of this morning's discussion, led by a distinguished panel of scholars sitting here on my right. Let me begin, however, by briefly outlining the kind of general structure that we have planned for this morning's discussions. The first hour or so will really be given over to statements and observations by our panelists here. We will then break for tea and coffee over at Fulton Hall after that for about 20 minutes or 25 minutes or so. I think you can't have an event here at the Institute without break for coffee at Fulton Hall. Just make sure we know where we are. We're going to be there for half an hour roughly. And then we'll reassemble back here for some discussion amongst the panelists themselves, and most importantly, hopefully for some conversation, Q&A and so on between the panelists and the audience here today. So we're certainly looking forward to that very, very much. Our distinguished panel this morning consists of 4 faculty of the Institute, each of which in their own and very different fashion has been and continues to be a transformative agent in their own area of scholarship. Taken together, at least in my view, the corpus of their work illustrates just why the Institute continues to be one of the important hubs of scholarship in the humanities and social sciences. Moreover, it at least is interesting and telling to me that the influences each of these morning's panelists extends well beyond their particular field. Indeed, although I am an economist, I have read with great interest and profit a great deal of the work of each of them, and has certainly enriched my own experience and scholarly background as well. Now, to avoid too much up and down here on the stage, I will briefly introduce each of the panelists now, and then ask each to address you. And I think I will introduce them in the order in which they are going to speak. It actually works out from my left to right, the way we have to sit ourselves here, although that wasn't planned. The first to speak this morning will be Joan Wald-Scott, the Harold F. Linder Professor in this School of Social Sciences. Joan's groundbreaking work has challenged the foundation of conventional historical practice, including the nature of historical evidence and historical experience and the role of narrative in the writing of history. Broadly, the objective of her work is the question of difference in history, its uses, enunciations, implementations, justifications, and transformation in the construction of social and political life. Sitting next to her is Didier Fassin, who's a James D. Wilkinson Professor in the School of Social Science. He's an anthropologist and a sociologist who has conducted field studies in Senegal, Ecuador, South Africa, and France. Trained as a physician in internal medicine and public health, he dedicated his early research to medical anthropology, illuminating important issues around the AIDS epidemic, social inequalities in health, and the changing landscape of global health. More recently, he has developed a new domain of inquiry he terms, and I put in quotation marks, political and moral anthropology, analyzing the reformation of injustice, reformulation of injustice and violence as suffering and trauma, the expansion of international humanitarian government, and the contradictions in the contemporary politics of life. His present project, The Contribution to the Anthropology of the State, explores the political and moral treatment of disadvantaged groups, including immigrants and refugees, through an ethnography of police, justice, and prison. Abishai Marley, sitting also to my right, is one over, George F. Kennan Professor in the School of Historical Studies, is one of the foremost thinkers and commentators on the contemporary human condition, the moral issues of our time, and the current problems facing Western societies. In addition to his influence as a philosopher, he is highly regarded for his profound and cogent observations of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the broader struggle between Islam and the West. On my far right is Jonathan Israel. Many of you heard him yesterday speaking a wonderful lecture he gave us yesterday afternoon. He is professor in the School of Historical Studies. His work is concerned with European and European colonial history from the Renaissance to the 18th century. His recent work focuses on the impact of radical thought, especially Spinoza, Bayle, Diderot, and the idea of democracy, equality, toleration, freedom of press, and individual freedom. Many books focused on these subjects. So let me now turn to our very distinguished panel and call on Joan first.
Thank you. We decided that it would be more panel-like if we sat rather than came up to the podium. My comments take off from a new book by historian Samuel Moyn, who was a member in the School of Historical Studies in 2008-9. It's called The Last Utopia: Human Rights in History. And it takes issue with the idea that there's a continuous evolution in the idea of human rights from the Enlightenment, or the French Revolution, American French Revolution, to the present. Moyn argues instead that the concept of individual human rights, and individual is the crucial term, as we know it today, an internationalist cause that was, quote, a pure alternative in an age of ideological betrayal and political collapse, end of quote, came into its own only in 1977, and he's very precise about that year. In that year, Charter 77 was founded in Czechoslovakia. President Jimmy Carter invoked human rights in his inaugural address, and Amnesty International, the grassroots group devoted to, quote, saving the world one individual at a time, won the Nobel Peace Prize. A year later, Helsinki Watch, which in 1988 became Human Rights Watch, came into being, and Václav Havel wrote that human rights were the power of the powerless, by which he meant that human rights were not about the rights of citizens within the nation state, as they had been for at least 2 centuries. They were instead a way of challenging, in Moyn's words, the sovereign nation state from above and outside, rather than serve as its foundation. Rights were no longer taken to be the prerogative of citizens who were members of a specific political community, he argues, but instead belonged to all as a function of their humanity. For Moyn, this represents a profound change, a substitution of morality for older forms of politicized struggle, a sign of the failure of the utopian politics of redemption, whether socialist, communist, anti-communist, or anti-colonial. Moyn's goal in the book is to offer an alternative history, one that stresses not the origins of ideas, but their contingent emergence, one that thinks in terms not of linear continuities, but of sharp breaks, one that insists on exploring the different meanings that the same words can have at different historical moments. It's an important exercise, and if you want to see how he makes his case, which I think is more or less convincing depending on the part of the book you read, you can read the book. But for now, and I have to say, although his approach to history is one that I take myself, it's not what I want to talk about or do today. I want to come at the question of rights in history from a different angle, one that focuses on an ongoing tension within the conception of rights itself. itself, whether the rights of the citizen of the American and French revolutions or the more recent human rights for the victims of totalitarian rule. That is the tension between rights conceived as formal limits on the power of states, whether the limit comes from inside or outside, and rights conceived as positive social or economic entitlements. The first is associated with the formal rights of individuals before the law, the second with the social rights of groups as well as individuals. The first rests on an abstract concept of the individual, shorn from his social, cultural, and economic locations, and for that reason equal. All citizens are equal to one another in this view precisely